Welcome back to Second Breakfast. We have a very special episode for you today. Normally we talk about works of art on the show. We talk about movies, books, TV shows, songs, paintings, all kinds of things. Today we are talking about a work of art, but it's a very special work of art because the creator of this work of art is Cam, my co-host right here. Cam has written another book. This is his latest book. It's called Tarts in Space. And we're doing a series of interviews to talk about this book as a way to get you hyped, to help you know more about it. And it's going to be a 3-part interview series. This is part 1. So Cam is like, I don't know if y'all know this. Cam is one of those people that does everything for all of his projects. Cam wrote, edited, co-starred, produced, did all the production for this entire book. And so we're going to talk about the different elements of his creative process in these interviews. So this first series, or this first part in this series, is going to be about the writing of this book. Cam, are you excited to talk about this?
Yeah, it was a pretty tough interview to get, but your people talked to my people and we hashed something out.
Perfect. I'm so excited. So I've got a few questions and I'm excited to hear you talk about this fantastic book. If y'all don't know, Tarts in Space is how would you describe it? It's a sci-fi, it's a dark comedy sci-fi?
Yeah, the way I pitched it in the little announcement trailer, which you can see on our social media or as a little YouTube short, is I called it a light science fiction dark comedy.
Perfect.
I liked the sort of symmetry there. Light science fiction refers to, it's as opposed to hard sci-fi, which is the really technical, detailed, scientifically accurate. Light sci-fi is more accessible, but also looser with the reality of things. Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is usually a comparison there for light science fiction, and it's more in that vein, but it's also, first and foremost, a comedy.
Awesome. I'm excited to talk about that. That's a helpful pitch for it. Thank you. And just so y'all know, I've read and listened to this entire book. It's fantastic. It's so funny, and I can't wait for y'all to get to read it and listen to it. So Cam, let's talk about the origins of Lemon Tarts. I have the privilege of, I'm married to you, so I know things, but the audience doesn't know.
That keeps on giving.
It sure does. I know you've been working on this for a long time, and what I mean by that is you started working on it a long time ago, and then you returned to it very recently. So when did you first start writing Lemon Tarts? How did you get to where we are now?
So I was working on a horror book. That one's still kind of a work in progress. It's something I'm tinkering with. It will be the only thing that matters after my death. It's the Faustus book. You guys have heard me talk about Faustus for 400 episodes now. So I was spending many months in the Faustus trenches, and that was tough. It's horror, it's drama, it's religion, it's big ideas and tension, and I love that. There's sort of a melancholy and misery that I really take to there. And the day after I finished that project, at that point, I just needed to get something else out of my system. I had all these repressed, all the silly, dumb bullshit that I like doing in comedies. I hadn't done that for so long at that point. It had been a few years since I'd written a comedy. So the day after I finished that project, I just cranked out this short story. And it didn't even have a title. It was called, I think the document in my computer is still called Untitled Science Fiction Project.
Oh, that's cool.
And I basically wrote it in one go. I remember it. It was the morning after. And it was like 3,000 words. And eventually I called it Lemon Tarts, just as a vernacular in my head. And it was one story about a space captain on this ship, and he was being chased around by this little green blob of an alien. And I didn't know what to call it. I didn't know if I was going to make up some proper noun for, like xenomorph or any of that.
Sure, yeah.
But it was loosely, not intentionally, but after the fact, I can definitely see that it was inspired by the last act of Alien and that whole cat and mouse with the one human and the one alien. I love the tension there, but doing that in the silliest way possible by having the character be really, really dumb and goofy and pretentious, and having this alien just be this devouring, screeching, squealing monster. I just liked that. I like simple concepts with basically two characters going back and forth. So I did that in one day, and I had this little story, and it just, it gutted out of my system, and then I rebalanced and moved on to 100 other projects. And then it was, 3 or 4 years later.
I was going to say, I remember you wrote that first short story in 2020. Because it was during the pandemic.
Okay, yeah.
I remember that. And so then you went back to this, I guess about a year ago now. So that would have been a 3-year gap between the two.
Yeah. So creatively, I sort of set aside 2024 to go back to a lot of those unfinished projects. And I've got a lot of those. Some of them are like, I'm a couple yards from the finish line. Some of them are just gestures that I've begun. And I kind of interviewed myself. I speed dated all of these different projects and saw what was speaking to me now. And for some reason, Lemon Tarts was. And that was weird because I thought that was done. I thought that was just a little short story. And I had this idea for another story. I did cover art for it, actually. Maybe we can find a way to put that in the book or something. But it was this idea for a similar sci-fi tinge story with a very small cast and a really dark, wicked sense of humor. Because even though the character in that first chapter is dumb, I think the humor is really sharp. It's not goofy and light. It's really sharp and deadly.
Yeah.
And that's what was speaking to me. So I had an idea for another story called Electric Tumor. And it was basically making the alien a big tumor.
Right.
To be able to talk about cancer and play with a bunch of these ideas, but in like a physical form. Instead of just having it be an invader from outer space in a far-off land, I wanted it to be something that felt more personal and tangible. So I was batting around that idea, and I realized it was almost a prequel to the Lemon Tarts idea. And then the gears started turning. And instead of having 2 connected short stories, it bubbled into 3. And what happened if these characters met? And how can you blend these timelines? And then I bought a corkboard from Target, and I started putting up index cards of interesting scenes and chapter titles. And then it turned into 6 chapters that would go across this saga of these 2 space captains and this alien that is a tumor. Like, how do you explain that? Where does it come from? Why does it have teeth? And in the writing of it, that then ballooned into 10 full chapters. So I didn't expect any of this to turn into a project as big and thorough as it is, but I think it was so great to return to comedy so many years later. And I found the writing of this project incredibly liberating and freeing.
Well, I imagine, that the creative projects that are the most rewarding are the ones that unfold in ways you don't expect or ways that you hadn't planned on. And then they kind of just become, I don't know, like sentient on their own and have their own agency. And that, I imagine, can be really fun for you as a creator.
Yeah, I mean, it's agony most of the time. It's slamming your head against the wall and trying to solve problems.
I've seen it.
But when it is working and when it does kind of fly out of your control, it's Nicole Kidman. It's the indescribable feeling. As the lights begin to dim. It's that.
Yeah.
And there were a lot of those moments here, and I tried to let that breathe more than I usually would. I tried to dance around the outline instead of being how I would. I mean, you guys know from listening to the podcast, Maggie comes in loose, and she has minimal notes, and she can dance around and respond to stuff. Tristan is like this too, and I have rigorous notes and structure and outlines, and I'm not really like that in the creative space. I think there is a lot of problem solving and structure, but there is a lot more of the looseness there too, and I was really trying to lean into enjoying both of those halves of the process here, which is why I let this thing accordion out from being 3,000 words to 30 something, however long it is now.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. And that's interesting that you wanted to be so like loose and organic with it when you've chosen such a restrictive genre of sci-fi. Like, comedy is very open and fluid and responsive and spontaneous and improvisational, right? But I feel like sci-fi is rigid. So what drew you to do something that was a little less familiar to you? Because you said you'd written a lot of comedy before and you still continue to now. I feel like that's one of your biggest things, but sci-fi was new for you. So what drew you to do that?
So I'm reminded of something Tristan told me about myself. You guys are good for that. You guys tell me truths about myself that I would never see otherwise. And one of them was basically every time I say something about myself or just make declarations about me and what I like and who I am, I'm usually wrong. Those are usually like outdated things I just say without even questioning or believing them. And one of them is that I don't really like sci-fi. I think I've said this before on the show that I prefer to watch or play sci-fi, and I prefer to read fantasy.
Yeah, okay.
And I think you can track a lot of the sci-fi I do like. I think in starting this book, because I have technically worked in science fiction a little bit before, similar story to this one. I started writing a short story about lobsters that was supposed to be 2 pages, and it is a 60,000 word novel. I have to do a little editing, and then I'll get that one out into the universe too. But that one ends up with some sci-fi elements in it. But this is the first, captains, spaceships, the moon, sci-fi that I've ever really done.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think it's different than... I think I ignored what I used to view as the limitations of the genre. It's sort of a grab bag of things I love within this genre, because it's not true that I don't like sci-fi. I love Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Mm-hmm. I think that's, if you're talking about comedy in a sci-fi, I mean, that's the elephant in the room.
Yeah, that's
right?
The gold standard, yeah.
But I don't think it's the only influence. I think it did scare me away from the genre, because I'd felt like, oh, it has been done to perfection. There's no
right.
need for anyone else to jump in that sandbox.
Yeah.
But I think, again, I'm wrong. Because one of the series I grew up on, I mean, we talk about Harry Potter and millennials, and these things are baked into our DNA. It's an incredibly strong cultural memory. But equal right on that level for me when I was growing up was Artemis Fowl. And that's sci-fi.
Oh, totally. It's like it's got elements of fantasy, but it's pretty sci-fi.
And it's not in space, so I never thought about it that way. But it's all about tech.
Yeah, it's true.
It's absolutely sci-fi.
Yeah.
And I love that so much as an adventure. We did an episode about the first Star Wars movie, which I still think is the best science fiction movie. It's such a fun, propulsive adventure. And I love how light the science is there. And then, of course, after I started writing this, after I finished writing this, I got into Dune. And that's hard sci-fi.
Yes.
And that is not me.
That's not what you're doing here.
But
right.
the other things that I really loved and tried to kind of roll into the blender, the smoothie of whatever this project is, were some of the sci-fi projects I love to play. Because as much as I grew up with Artemis Fowl, I grew up with Halo and Gears of War.
Yeah.
And those are sci-fi too.
Right.
And those are big, rollicking, almost explosive blockbuster adventure stories. And I think when you walk through Barnes & Noble and you see sci-fi and it's all of these like dour covers and boring fonts and the books are all 1 million pages.
It's going to feel like doing homework when you read them, Yeah,
I think that's why I had this idea in my head that I didn't like sci-fi. But I love so many of these elements across all these, this medium, that medium, and rolling those into one and just doing what I liked of sci-fi instead of having to obey a genre convention.
Right, yeah, you don't have to follow rules. You're just doing what you want to do.
Yeah, I this project was me discovering or maybe remembering how much I love this genre.
Well, and you described it as light sci-fi, and I think apart from the comedy that gives the whole thing an element of levity, what else feels light sci-fi about it to you? Like, what distinguishes it from, a homework book?
So one of the rules, every creative project I do, I put rules on, and I think those help me just learn, and it gives you a tighter box. I think we've talked about this with Jack White. The more creative restrictions you put on yourself, the more you have to be creative to find solutions. Sometimes you have to put those shackles on yourself to give you something to strain against and react against.
Yes.
That lobster book, for example, is a comedy without dialogue. I wanted to see if I could make a comedy funny without verbal sparring and punchlines.
Just narration, yeah.
So I did a lot of creative limitations for this one. And one of those, because I was working in sci-fi, and I don't like that dry, hard sci-fi thing. I mean, I do now because of Dune, but you know what I mean.
Right. That's not what you wanted to focus on, yeah.
Right. I would never write like Frank Herbert.
Right.
That's not my thing.
Right.
So one of the rules I put on myself for this project was absolutely zero research, which I think makes it the most lightweight science fiction book you will ever read.
Uh-huh.
And a lot of that, I got to shout out my sister here. We affectionately call her Brother Samron on the show, but of course she's my twin sister, Sam. And she's always complimented my stupidity. Like, I realized I couldn't do a better sci-fi comedy than Artemis Fowl or Hitchhiker. I don't think those are the mountaintop. I'm not going to be on Mount Rushmore like Douglas Adams and Owen Colfer. I'm not, and that's fine. I can worship them from down here. I'm happy there. I can't do a better sci-fi than them. Sure as shit, I could do a dumber one. And the thing Sam has always loved from me is the dumb stuff.
Yeah.
Just like riffing and making up histories when I don't know anything about it.
Yeah.
Just kind of worming my way to a solution. There was a moment in the Cheesecake Factory where I was trying to describe the eras of history. Anyway, there's the dumbness there of you can't look up how anything about space travel works,
right,
or anything about the 60s or NASA or the Cold War or the Bay of Pigs. All of these are like, they become monologues in the book,
yes,
because it becomes the narrator trying to just bullshit their way towards an explanation of these things and trying to figure it out with context clues. Leaning into the stupid and really having fun there and not taking the science fiction seriously like homework, like you said.
Right.
I think that's what makes this light and what makes it funny. Instead of trying to intellectualize and going for something that's clever, I think this is much funnier.
Right. Well, I feel like that makes it more accessible too. I think a lot of people don't feel like classic sci-fi is for them because it feels intimidating, or it feels like if I read something that's hard sci-fi, I kind of feel a little stupid when I read it, because I'm like, oh, I don't really understand how this technology works or this scientific phenomenon that they're discussing works. Reading your book, it made me feel smart, because I was like, well, I don't know a lot about space travel, but like, you know what? I also kind of don't know what the Bay of Pigs was either. I don't think it was actual pigs, but I don't really know. And so there's a fun, like, I don't know, it makes you feel like, okay, we're in a safe space. We can have stupid thoughts. We can, like, I know that a hairdryer is not going to be an effective weapon against an alien, but I like that it is in this story. I think it just, the absurdity of it, you're on this like interesting level of absurdity that anything is possible, which is what's fun about sci-fi, like off the bat, is that there's all this creative freedom, like anything is possible because you're going beyond the limitations of our current technological situation. So that absurdity makes it just fun and playful.
It should be wondrous and creative. That's why we talk about how predictive science fiction can be. You see Star Trek having like touchscreen smartphones like 40 years before we did.
Right.
And I think you can turn that in a comedic direction and just have fun with it. There's a plot point in the book that is about Apollo 11. And that means that I needed to figure out what happened in the first, like, why did we have to get to number 11? What happened with the first 10? And I know, I guess, in my head that they all had different problems, but coming up with a comedic, like, bit for each one of those previous Apollo missions, that's fun and stupid. I can make that as dumb as humanly possible and have fun with that. So I think that's where I tried to look into my total ignorance as a comedic opportunity.
I like that, because then you have the two genres working together and not being like not fighting against one another. Can you tell me more about any other creative limitations or rules that you put on this project? I know that you do that for all of your projects. There's always some sort of word count rule or a limit about like how the structure of a chapter should work. Or so what were some of those creative limitations that you added to this book?
The first one that pops in my mind is this idea of duality. I really like 2-word titles. I really like 2-character stories, these two-handers. We talk about Dr. Faustus or Frankenstein, or modern example like The Lighthouse. I just like these stories. So this story basically has 2 characters. Every title of every chapter is 2 words or a contraction. And almost every line, almost every joke, almost every metaphor or image, and all the important lines of dialogue, I mean, this was part of the outlining and the structure, they all come back. There is this idea of repetition and reframing, and I like that sort of couplet idea of bringing something back in a different context. It's not just a callback, but it has a different resonance and a different feel to it. So there is an incredible level of duality baked into this if you're looking for it. If not, maybe some of them will click for you, but that was fun for me to structure it in this sort of call and response sort of way.
Yeah, that sounds really fun. And without spoiling anything, I think that helps us understand why your final chapter is called Echo Chamber. This like idea of things coming back, and that's really lovely.
2 captains, 2 ships, 2 timelines. Yeah, it's a good rule.
Did you have word count limitations for your chapters, or like how you wanted each chapter to wrap up?
Yeah, I mean, I've done that before too. This one was looser than some of the other ones I had. It was loosely 3,000 words. Again, I went in with on the corkboard, I had 6 chapters outlined, and I tried to have fun. You want to dance around the outline. You don't want a character decision to feel like a plot point that's just happening. You want them to grapple with it. You want them to consider the options. So in execution, it will always take a little longer than you're expecting. So I tried to be looser with that, which meant opening up the word count a little bit. It was roughly 3,000 words, but it went more or less, depending. And in the audio drama version, which is sort of the one that's a little closer to my heart, all of them average right around 20 minutes as episodes, which also leans into kind of a sitcom feel.
Yeah.
And gives it, I think, more of that comedic structure that we're used to. John Cleese talked about a movie being a really tough venue for comedy because you really want to be short and sweet. You don't want to overstay your welcome. You don't want people to get sick of the characters, the archetypes, the jokes.
Yeah.
So you want to just get in and out. And viewing this in an episodic way, it turned out to be 10 episodes or chapters, viewing those as individual pieces. We talk about comics a lot on the channel, and I was trying to structure this in a way of, if this were like a 10-issue miniseries and you picked up one of them and you read through it, would you feel satisfied? Would you feel like you got your money's worth? You got a few laughs, you got some plot movement, and I think that sort of balancing made me, like, I didn't want to have one clear favorite chapter. I didn't want one to be, oh, this is where all the funny stuff happens.
That's the good one. Yeah.
This is the plot one, and these 3 are set up. We talked about this a lot in House of the Dragon for 8 or 10 weeks with Tristan. And I think one of the points we made there was that setup doesn't have to be boring.
Right.
It doesn't have to feel like setup. There's a magic trick when you're telling a story where you can be setting up 50 different things at the same time and the audience doesn't realize
it. Right, because it's also telling its own individual story within that chapter or episode or section or whatever.
Yeah, you can have an adventure that sets up something else quietly in the background. So I didn't want to have any downtime. I wanted to have this episodic, exciting structure. I don't remember what your original question was at this point.
Just asking about your creative rules and limitations.
But that was one of them, was like no downtime chapters.
Yeah.
Everything has to circle back and make it feel worthwhile and episodic, like those chunks you remember from the first Star Wars, those scenes that really stick with you, those levels that I love so much from Halo or Gears of War. Try to evoke the best parts of the genre, do it quick, be punchy, and then get the fuck out of there.
Well, I think apart from the final chapter, I think every section ends on a cliffhanger, right? So again, it's adding to that level of excitement, like, because I think that's also what you seem to be leaning into in the sci-fi thing. Is not just the silliness and the technology and the creativity, but also how adventurous it can be and how much, like, how exciting sci-fi can be, sort of leaning into that alien thing like you talked about. So I like you ending everything on a cliffhanger like that. Yeah,
I love that. I think I take that back to like the Adam West Batman, of ending on the cliffhanger of the same bat time, same bat channel. I always find that exciting and worthwhile.
Yeah.
So if you can end with a knockout character revelation or a nail-biting cliffhanger, do that as much as humanly possible. Like, there's, if the first chapter is the last chunk of Alien, it's a very silly version of a slasher.
Sure.
With a really overpowered alien and a really dumb final boy, I guess, as this captain.
Not even man, boy.
Yeah. So if you can keep some of that going, you've got some of that built-in suspense and cliffhangers and cat and mouse kind of reversals. So I really wanted to just pedal to the metal this. It could have been longer. I wanted it to be as tight as possible.
Yeah.
You cut the jokes that aren't quite up to snuff. You cut the side plots of the character things. I want this to be all killer, no filler.
I really think it is. I think you went beyond what your original limitation was. You had planned for 6 chapters and you let it organically grow into 10, but I still think even with that, it's very tight and neat. Can you tell me more about your process? I know that you, just being married to you, seeing you create things for the last 10, 15 years, you have different processes for each thing that you create. And I mean in terms of like influences that you're engaging with, like you talked about, John Cleese, and you talked about Douglas Adams and, Owen Colfer. But I know that you've always got like a specific playlist for whatever project you're working on, or you exclusively write on a typewriter, or you exclusively write on your computer or handwrite. So tell me about what the actual writing process was like before you moved into any of the audio production and all of that.
Okay, yeah, I've got a couple of things that just came to mind. One is that I wrote most of this by hand in libraries. When I was working on the Faustus project, I wrote that by hand in little notebooks in churches around New York. almost every day. And I found that to be just an incredible experience. It really changed the way you felt. So I tried to do some of that here. And when I was typing into the computer or I got in a groove and I was writing on the computer, my entire draft was in Courier New, which is that old-timey typewriter font. And that is the feel of sci-fi I like. We were talking about Alien Romulus a few weeks ago. Loved that movie because it leaned into the aesthetic of the original.
Yeah.
And the aesthetic of Alien is as good as the Alien. You know, you want the big buttons, you want the blinking lights. I love that so much in Star Wars. Anytime you have a wall of blinking lights,
incredible.
That's fucking sci-fi.
Yeah, all the buttons, all the clicky clacky. I don't know any of these buttons but I'm so excited about them.
The computer talking, it's kind of scary.
Oh yeah.
All the lights in like 2001: A Space Odyssey.
Oh yeah.
That stuff is what I gravitate to. So writing this in Courier New. Actually, when I wrote the short story version years ago, I made the background. It was in Microsoft Word at the time. I made the background black, and I made the font bright green. Because that's what I wanted it to be.
Yeah, like an old-timey computer.
That's
incredible.
what I want sci-fi to feel like.
Yeah.
And the glory of self-publishing, and like you were talking about wearing a lot of hats and doing a lot of this, is that I can make those decisions. And when I made the decision to publish this book in Courier New, I think that's sort of an olive branch of this is what I love about sci-fi. Like, take my hand, join me on this journey, and let's go have fun with it. Instead of like, well, it has to be in a respectable Garamond or Cambria or all these stupid ass, official, respectable New York Times bestseller fonts.
Yeah.
Fuck that. I wanted this to be fun. It's supposed to be funny. And I think this font, I mean, this sounds stupid, but when you're staring at a screen all day, when you're in your head coming up with ideas, Courier New's a funnier font.
Sure. Yeah.
It's goofier. So That's my answer, I guess, for how I got myself in the mood there. Musically, this one was weird. You're right that I always have a playlist, and it's never music that's like tonally appropriate.
Right. That's what's so interesting about it. It's never like, oh, well, I'm going to listen to the Alien soundtrack, or I'm going to listen to, like, it's never anything like that. It's always like the one I remember you listening to is 9 Inch Nails.
Yeah, it's never what you expect, but I always write to music. I always have music going, and I'll end up just looping something, whether it's an artist or an album.
When something catches, you kind of glom onto it.
Sometimes it's a song. I've spent 5 hours writing to the same song before. Sure. If you find that groove, you just got to hold on to it as tight as you can. And a lot of this, there were a couple big musical influences here. A lot of it was the harder, earlier 9 Inch Nails stuff and some of those remixes. I think that industrial metal sound has some of that sci-fi aesthetic that I like to it. I just said it was discordant, but I think there is some of that there, because if you were to describe the aesthetic of Alien, I think you would mention it feeling industrial. Weyland-Yutani, and the thing we love about Star Wars is all of the ships that have this like brushed, screwed up old metal, or when you're in the Empire ships and it's all this strict white or strict black. There is an industrial feeling to a lot of these aesthetics, and I like to kind of ride the wave of music, and no one creates better waves or vibes than Trent Reznor and 9 Inch Nails. I also, because, I mean, we'll talk about this in a bit, I'm sure, but a lot of this book is wrapped up in me and Tristan. And he, of course, is one of our lead characters in the audio drama version as Captain Duncan Arugula. And I remember this was about 10 years now, because we're all getting obscenely old, that he turned us onto a band called Royal Blood.
Oh, yeah.
Which, back to the duality thing, is a two-piece. I love two-piece bands more than anything else. The Kills, the White Stripes, and Royal Blood. It's bass and drums. And they hit like a freight train. The guitar, or the bass tone that he gets is just sick. And the drums are just pounding on your chest. And those first couple albums are so good. And then they went in this weird, almost dance, a little bit of techno-y direction. And those albums never made sense to me. And I always go back to albums from artists I love that I don't get to try to make sense of them. And I was just in that groove here. And some of those songs clicked for me. Some of those more dancey songs, they clicked for me while I was starting this project. So like the song Oblivion off of their third album, Typhoons. I listened to that probably 1,000 times writing this book. And jumping between that and that really hard industrial edge of 9 Inch Nails, and then for the quieter moments, because, a book can't just be one tone. You would grow numb to it. There have to be as many character moments, especially when you're playing with cancer and a slasher and all sorts of fun shit. You need some character moments that are quieter. You need some contemplation, some reflection, some grief, whatever the scene calls for. I went back to a lot of early Delta blues. So the playlist, if you shuffle it, which is what I do, is chaos. It's an absolute mess. But I think those three things together helped me kind of ride the lightning toward this strange negotiated tone that the project demanded.
I really like that. I wonder if we should make those playlists public for
If
people
you know
to
how to
listen
do that, then I'll do that.
Okay, that'll be fun. Little perk of, really get in tune with Cam's psyche, I guess. No, I love that.
I wish you could see how wide Maggie's eyes just went.
I just got so excited.
Psyche.
It's
How polite.
It's wild in there. Can you tell us more about the format? You said, you've alluded to this is an audio drama, but it's also a novel. And you've got this history with audio drama. That was really, I think, your first love. And the first things that you wrote and did with Tristan were proper audio dramas. They weren't even available as text. And in other projects you've done, you've made the scripts available to read. But in this project, you've got the full audio drama, but you've also got a novelization that goes beyond just the pure script of the audio drama. So can you talk about, number one, why you made the choice to have both of those formats, and two, how the adaptation of the novel form sort of affected the final project? What was that like?
There's a lot there, so you'll have to help me if I get too off track.
I got you, don't worry.
I say this to people all the time because we do this show 2 or 3 times a week, depending. I believe in audio. We're available on YouTube. You might be watching this on YouTube right now, but I view this as a podcast. I genuinely really love the auditory medium, whether it is audiobooks or podcast or music, like we just spent 10 minutes on. I believe in audio. I don't think it is like a little sibling to video.
Sure.
I don't think video podcasts are better than audio podcasts. If anything, I think focusing on that one medium is everything. So as a storyteller, I guess, I think audio dramas are sort of the perfect form because a lot of storytelling is engaging someone's imagination. Right? Even if they're watching the same movie or reading the same book, everyone's going to come away with a different version of it, a different impression, a different feeling, almost a different experience, which is fascinating. And you can't write for all of that, but I think that's a fun side effect of it.
I think that's why I like reading books so much, is because it's so personal and subjective. You know?
Yeah, because I feel like books give you the most room to participate, to kind of put your own stink on whatever line of dialogue you're reading, to interpret things different ways. That's why we can debate Shakespeare or Marlowe 400 years later.
Right.
Because you can read King Lear, you can read Othello a million different ways, and they're all equal. That's part of what I love to do when we're, spitting dumb theories about works of art. I think that's where that comes from. But in the audio field, you also get some performance. And this is where, because I'm a control freak, when I give someone a gift, I let them unwrap it and then I take it back from them and explain it to them and tell them why they should like it.
It's quite an experience to receive a gift from Cam, and it's always the most thoughtful gift you've ever received. So I think it's worth it to let you take it right back and tell me all about it.
But that part's important to me too. And if you're writing a novel or you're writing a short story, you have complete control. And I think that can be as good as it can be bad. So in a form like audio drama or even a straight audio book, like I told you, the book about lobsters, no dialogue there. That's just narration. That is more of a straightforward audio book. But there's still performance there. There are still jokes that you're telling, performances. I remember when I was in college, when I found the audio drama format, right? Because I've been listening to Mugglecast since I was 14 on an iPod Nano while emptying out my dog's litter box. I distinctly remember that experience.
What a specific memory.
I don't know why. Some things, the needle just drops and you lock in those memories. But when I discovered the audio drama format, I think it was as important to me as the substance of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy because it felt like the perfect happy medium of all of these different things I loved, because I love that performance aspect. When I was in college, off of eBay, I bought a cassette reading, an audiobook of the first Hitchhiker book that Douglas Adams read himself.
Wow.
Because I enjoy author's intent. I enjoy the way an author felt about a book. So imagine if we had Charles Dickens reading some of his stories. Imagine if we had Shakespeare perform, because he did perform as well. Imagine if you had him performing To Be or Not to Be, and you could see, like, what is the canon way to enunciate in that speech?
What did he intend? What was his actual vision? Yeah, that would feel like the purest form of that text. Yeah.
So there's this, like, I'm kind of two minds here, because I love an amazing audiobook or audio drama performance from a professional actor.
Sure.
They can bring it to life. Hard Times by Charles Dickens. The guy who played the freaky maester who brought the mountain back to life in Game of Thrones.
Yes.
I'm sorry, I'm blanking on his name.
Pycelle.
No, not Pycelle.
Sorry, the other one.
His name, Qyburn, I think?
Yes, Qyburn.
So that actor's name is Anton Lesser. And he did an audiobook of Hard Times by Charles Dickens, which I read in grad school, I think. And he brought that story to life in a way that me reading the book, I would never have understood it that well. He had an intimacy, a familiarity. He breathed life into that text in an almost miraculous way. Dan Stevens doing Frankenstein, same thing.
Yeah.
So on one hand, I really love when a great actor can add their own spin to a book and really take it to the next level. But I also love that idea of an author reading their own story, and that inflection and that feeling. I think they're both valuable. So when I discovered that I could sort of split the difference there, and perform my stories
as an author, right? But
while also being the author,
right?
Because especially when you're writing comedy, I hear the punchlines in my head. Like, I know the voice of the character, and I know how they're delivering or putting a spin on a certain line. If I can live up to that, if I can be as good an actor as I am in my head, which I think is the torture of all authors, if you can live up to that vision, whatever that fleeting runaway thing in your head is, that's the dream. And I think the audio drama is the only format that can really bottle that experience. Because if you're making a movie, there are a million other people, millions of dollars, studios, all sorts of interference separating you from a pure artistic vision. Sometimes writer-directors will get close, but you're telling someone what to think and what to see. And that's fine, but I don't think that's where my author heart lives. So if I'm just making an audio drama, there's still space for you to picture however the fuck you want Captain Duncan Arugula to look. And I never, ever describe characters, because I don't care about that. I will give you their voices, and you can fill in the rest. I want to leave space for you as an audience member, as a reader, as a listener. I just want to do some of that work. I want to give you their voices. I want to tell you how the narration should be delivered, and then you run away with the rest of it. And I think the audio drama is the perfect format for that. It's incredibly difficult.
Yeah, I imagine.
Because I can second guess it to death. I can re-record it to death because it has to live up to this fucking platonic ideal that's haunting and torturing me in my head. But when you do it, and when you have the discipline to like try to get there, I think that is the closest I can get to handing you part of my brain. And that's what a book is.
I love that. I love that. And so then when you've got this novel version, right, you can no longer rely on the performances of you and Tristan as, carrying the interpretation of the book, carrying that feeling. And so that was sort of your challenge. I remember when you said, well, I want to have this as a novel as well, but if you just have the script, you can't have the inflection that I put on a joke. You can't have the voice crack that Duncan has when he's terrified, right? So then you had the challenge of putting it into a novel version to still give the audience some of those cues and help, demonstrate your vision. But I know it was hard for you, and it was different than just, having a script. So can you talk about that process?
That was an incredible challenge, and I mean that in a good way. I think that helped me grow and learn a lot from that experience. But when you start it, it feels like you don't want to just sub in stage direction. You don't want to just throw in tonal cues or adverbs every time someone opens their mouth.
Yeah, he said nervously,
he shook. Like you don't want to just over-explain, especially with jokes. You don't want to just over-explain things and remove all that interpretation.
Especially when you've got such a tight, fast pace. Like, you're not trying to spend time describing things.
Yeah, there's a rhythm to storytelling.
Yeah, and to comedy.
Right. So the more you explain, you slow it down. You ruin that flow. And there are also things in audio that you can't translate. There are sound effects in this book that I made. I made all of them with my mouth. I don't use other things. I just, if I want a door closing, if I want, there's a moment where someone's talking over an intercom and they turn off the radio, I make that little, like I can make that noise. I think that's fun. And it's also funnier, the more lo-fi and simple that is. But how do you, if that made you giggle just there, how do you turn that into a line in a novel? Even if you do over-explain it, it's not funny anymore. So I had to find a lot of these moments where I could accent a feeling. And it wasn't just, I would listen back to a chapter from the audio drama and then try to shift it and convert this script into a novel. And a lot of that, when I moved past the idea of, okay, we're just doing stage direction for all of this shit, when I moved from that into, this is an opportunity for me to get more jokes in there. You can explain how a character's feeling. You can say that they're on the verge of crying or there's a voice crack, but there's a funny way to do that. You turn this into a creative challenge instead of just like a logistical challenge. And at this point, they are two different beasts. I feel like being in the shoes of this project helped me understand Douglas Adams a little more. He's still the mountaintop and I'm on the ground level. But the way he wrote Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy as an audio drama, and then he adapted it years later into a novel, and then he wrote the screenplay for the movie. So those are all different beasts. There are different lines. Characters feel different. And I always struggled with that in the early days of like, which one is canon? Which one is my favorite?
What's the real story? Yeah.
But having done something lesser but similar now, they're different beasts. I will always feel fonder of the audio drama because there's so much of me in that.
Yeah.
There's so much of Tristan in that and us playing around together and doing these voices and the sound effects and the noises that the alien makes. I mean, come on.
It's incredible, yeah.
And I mean, in the script, there is stage direction for that. So when I record, I know what kind of sneezing, squirgling snarl to make like that. I know how to do that. But the novel is its own beast now. And it has, I don't know, a couple hundred probably jokes or changes that aren't in the audio drama. And being okay with that has made me feel very happy about having this as a novel. I know some people don't like audio. I know some people can't really process audio books. Obviously, some people can't hear as well. So I wanted to have it available in different formats here. And I think they are distinct but interesting beasts. I didn't want it to feel like just publishing a script. I think this is a novel. This is not a tweaked screenplay or something. It is a novel.
Right. No, you're so right. I was going to say, like, I have listened to and read both versions, and they are distinct experiences, and both reward you in unique ways. And I found it very valuable and rewarding and fun to experience both. And I like that you're right. It means it appeals to more kinds of people, more readers, more enjoyers of stories. Very fun.
And I know as myself, because I am a control freak and I like to really hyperfixate on things I love, I really enjoy reading all the different versions of Hitchhiker and kind of parsing the differences. Yeah. So if anyone were to care about this story enough, I think there's some meat on the bone there. There are some different things you'll notice in one medium versus the next.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Earlier you alluded to this, but I want to talk about it more. You talked about this story. Well, when you wrote Electric Tumor, the second short story that became basically the second chapter of this.
It's still called that, by the way.
It is. It's very fun. Obviously, there's a connection to cancer, and I know that sometimes a question about asking an author about their personal experience can sometimes be so dull or induce a lot of eye rolling because artists are not always drawing on their own like exclusive personal experience in their own work. Like sometimes you're just writing about something because it's interesting, not because it's your own personal experience. But I happen to know that there is a clear personal connection in Lemon Tarts with the Cancer Allegory. So I would love if you could talk about that and what parts of the cancer or cancer adjacent experience were important for you to include and explore in this book.
Yeah, so I guess there are every episode is someone's first episode. So I guess I've talked about this at some length before. I did an episode about Fallout 3, and I talked about cancer a lot in that one. That was also, I don't know, that was probably the most personal I've gotten about this. But I guess the TLDR here is just that I have a lot of experience with cancer and years and years and years of my mom having cancer, breast cancer, and ultimately dying from that through my childhood and adolescence. And obviously that was the most formative thing that has ever happened in my life from the time I was 14 to just about 21. She had the most aggressive form of breast cancer possible and fought like a bat out of hell for that many years through, chemo, radiation, surgery and clinical trials, and I've seen as ugly as this can get, and it's not just that. It's as many grandparents as you can name, and dogs, and all through the family tree there's cancer there. So that has influenced, I think, a lot of the things I've made in different ways. The Faustus book, when that's eventually out there, and you look back on, oh, he wrote that dumbass sci-fi thing first. There's a lot of grief in that book, and that's horror, which I think plays with grief in a different way. This story is not about grief. This is a comedy, and I think grief is almost overdone in the last 10 years.
Yeah, the Hereditary train really set it in motion.
Sure. And I think it's been done incredibly well. Haunting of Hill House, like you said, Hereditary. Of course.
Right.
I think a lot of those stories are gorgeous, but I don't have anything to add there. I wanted to talk about cancer in a way that was interesting and challenging. This book is not about me. It's not about my experience. It's not about my family. It is a jumping off point. I think there are experiences and feelings and part of the world and human condition you see when you go through that forever and move around the country in different hospitals. And there's a feeling of impotence and powerlessness and resentment. And it takes you in sort of a philosophical, existential direction. And the thing I love about sci-fi, and I was always cheering at the screen watching Alien Romulus every time there was like a beautiful, sad, melancholy shot of a spaceship floating through space with this incredible, massive planet or asteroid belt in the background. I find that genre contemplative, and I found myself diving deeper and deeper into that. And this is the most fun part, turning it into comedy. So I wrote and published my first book a month after my mom died, and wrote the majority of that book, which was the most like balls to the wall, just punchline, just be as funny as humanly possible. I wrote the majority of that book while she was in hospice at home. So I have always had the link of comedy and the most like traumatic, fucked up, imaginable things happening. I've always linked those things, and I think it makes me funnier. I think it sort of breaks down the inhibitions a little bit. There's something liberating about seeing the worst possible things that can happen. So I wanted to talk about cancer in a way that I found challenging, instead of just cancer bad. What if you make cancer the alien, and then that alien is kind of a character?
Right.
Like, I guess minor spoilers here, but one of those aliens who in this story I call the problem, one of these problems becomes more of a character through the course of the book. We give him a name and we follow him. So the idea of getting inside a cancer's head and writing it as a character in a comedy, a very violent, dark comedy, that is a fun creative challenge for me. That is not me writing my sad memoir.
Sure.
That is something I think fun and worthwhile from like a comedic perspective. So that's how I tried to kind of spin it into something that was rewarding instead of just, I don't know, navel gazing.
Sure. Did you find that doing this, did it help you, I don't know, work through any of these things? Not that none of it's fresh. It's been in your life for a long time, and your mom died almost 10 years ago. But did you find that you better understood something about yourself or your experience or anything like that? Like, was it in any way, was it a therapeutic exercise, or was it more just an interesting, springboard for a creative experience?
I think I made it funnier. I think I've always enjoyed cancer jokes. We talked about this. I know I keep plugging other episodes, but it's germane. This is one conversation we've been having for 400 hours.
Sure.
We did an episode about Deadpool over on Patreon, the trilogy there, and kind of talking about the movements and vacillations between those three movies. And I've always talked about the first Deadpool as being my favorite cancer movie because it is the funniest and freest with that subject matter.
Yeah, it is not at all afraid of being funny about that, which I love.
There are plenty of cancer movies that take it on its face, and they're incredibly moving and worthwhile. In the same way, there are movies about grief and all these other like heavy subjects.
Right.
A Monster Calls, that's another cancer movie that takes it plain-faced. It has some fantastical, surreal elements, but it's a straightforward, negotiation of that topic. But I love how rough Deadpool is with the cancer comedy. And I find a lot of release in that. I think going to a sad cancer movie and going to a funny one, they are cathartic in different ways. So I think I make some of some really good cancer. I mean, it sounds like I'm tooting my own horn here, but there are a lot of great cancer jokes in this.
There absolutely are.
I earned those fucking things. And I stand by that humor is the only way to get through bad shit.
Yeah.
I think it brings people together. It takes power away from the bad thing, and it makes you laugh without you choosing to. It's involuntary. It's dark. This is why I call it a dark comedy. I mean, when I call it light science fiction dark comedy, I'm saying dark as a polite way to say cancer. It's a light science fiction cancer comedy, sci-fi cancer comedy. That's what this is.
Yeah.
So I don't think it was about helping me work through anything.
Sure.
I really, really liked the challenge of writing a character who was this like writhing, gnashing, monstrous blob. I mean, he's basically... What if Flubber was a tumor? That's what the problem is.
Yeah.
That's fun. And I think I learned from that. And I learned from having to decide where that character goes and what that character wants. I think I have a bit of a fuller understanding, but that was never the objective.
Sure. But again, it's nice that just organically unfolded and that became what the process was and what the experience was for you. That became the result.
There are characters in the book who have had cancer and have a closer relationship with the tumor and these subjects, and getting inside their heads and finding the comedy there, I think, was interesting. But this was never meant to be therapeutic for me. It was meant to be as funny as humanly possible.
Mm-hmm. It seems like, much in the way all of your creative stuff is, it just becomes therapeutic for you in that it's the thing that you love.
Yeah, no, the way to honor, I think, this subject matter is not to be saccharine or to, make it capital I important. I think it's to make it the funniest book that I wish my mom could read.
Yeah.
As one of the funniest people I've ever met. I think that was my objective.
I like that. I think that this... I mean, I know your mom would have loved this book. She would have cracked up. That's fantastic. I know that you intentionally included the cancer thing, and that was like a thoughtful, thought out thing that you included in this book. But in a lot of your projects, I noticed that a lot of your other personal things end up in there with or without your intention. Can you talk about other personal connections that are sort of laced throughout Lemon Tarts? Yeah,
I mean, there's a lot of dumb shit in there that I think it's... Sometimes the more specific you get, the more universal it connects with people. I know I said that wrong, but you know what I mean there.
No, I know exactly what you mean, yeah.
There's a reference in the book at one point to a brownie on a stick. And that is something I used to get at our local bakery when I was a kid. And it just came to me in the moment and I liked it. And including little bits like that, or, I have a beard. Then having a beard, I mean, it looks, if you've ever seen Marlowe, Shakespeare, I have a pointy beard. I have a devil beard. That's what it looks like. Which means I have a fucking topiary strapped to my head that I have to tend to as a little garden every single day of my life. I have to groom and shape this thing. And there are, you mentioned before, there's a plot point about hair dryers being turned into weapons to fight the cancer alien. Like, you're so far out on the branch there with stupid shit that I think that makes me smirk. The more dumb stuff you can involve there. There are jokes about oatmeal because I started eating oatmeal. Like, at some point you just surrender and let some of your life seep into the book, but it's those elements of me that I included more than this being a cancer confessional. It's more about some stuff in my head, some isolation, some COVID. The life of an author and a creative and a control freak is a lot of me staring at a brick fucking wall trying to solve a problem that no one else would even understand, never mind be able to settle. And there is a lot of loneliness there. And these two characters are two space captains in the middle of nowhere in different timelines who have been alone for a long time. So yeah, I think whether it's confidence or panic or a bunch of these other things that these guys go through, yeah, sure, I'll crib some of that from my own life.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And I think a lot of these things from you end up being not necessarily intentional, but or just kind of happenstance as part of the creative process. But I think it ends up giving the whole book just a really personal flavor. It feels very unique to you, but also, like you said, makes it easier to connect with as a reader, as a listener, because it feels like, oh, a real person wrote this and I can connect to it, even though, okay, maybe I've never had a brownie on a stick, but that seems like such a personal thing, and I also have personal memories of X, Y, and Z. So and rather than it being just super general, like any, AI computer could have written it, like an actual human being has touched this and has their own, personal experiences laced throughout that are also can be more generalized and I can connect to in my own way. So,
yeah, I think the other thing there, we talk about depictions of men a lot. We did an episode on Sing Sing a few weeks ago. I'm so in tune with our back catalog.
You really
today.
are.
But we talk about depictions of men a lot, and I think there's an element of men where there's a reluctance to be vulnerable and maybe a difficulty with expressing emotions.
Especially with each other.
Right.
Yes.
In a coherent, self-aware way. There's a difficulty with that. And with the main two characters in this book both being men, I tried to work in some of that and explore masculinity, not in the way that I think, again, has just been done a lot in the past 10 years as a critique, as a takedown, as a deconstruction. That's all fine. That's not what I'm interested in. I think exploring all the shades of masculinity and how these two guys are going to interact and maybe compete and maybe lean on each other and learn from each other. And that so much of that relationship is going to be unspoken because that's how men communicate. Leaning into that implication and how you can find that subtext in a performance. Or then, I have to do a novel version. How do I write in those little pinpricks, those provocations to get you to go on that journey and read between the lines of the dialogue? I had fun with that. But the other thing you're asking me about, things I pulled from my own life here, this book is also, I think, a lot about Tristan and I, because it's about male friendship. And he is my best friend and has been forever. As, two men, and you throw these two guys, and in the audio drama, we are the main characters. I think there's a lot of that rolled in here too. And reflections and references and Easter eggs and meditations. And I enjoyed those as jumping off points for comedy and drama.
Yeah. And I think that as a listener listening to this, even if you don't know that the two of you are good friends, I think the personal history that you have with one another plays out in the book itself, like because you both know so much about each other, and it's coming through in both your performances, which I think is very fun.
And we'll talk about this next week when we do the interview about the recording process.
Say this rolls perfectly into our part 2.
But most of the audio dramas I've ever done, I've done with Tristan. I know how to write to his voice. I know how to write to his strengths, and then he will still come in and do things I never imagined. And I think when I was talking about trying to be funny in the way that I am in person, when I was talking about my sister and those kind of conversational stupidities that really make people giggle, I am funniest with Tristan. I am funniest around Tristan, and trying to capture some of that in the writing process is one thing. But then when you're bringing it to life and you're in a room and you're holding the mics and you got to be funny on that level, bouncing off someone you trust and know, and then when that relationship is baked into the text, that was a fairly unbelievable experience.
Yeah, I'm so excited to talk to both of you about the recording experience in our part 2. I think it's going to be a really special conversation. Thank you so much for joining us today, Cam, for this interview about your book. Thank you, listener, for tuning in. I'm so excited for Cam to launch this book. It's really special. Please, if you have other questions about Cam's writing process, about the creation of Lemon Tarts, please put them in the comments below if you're on YouTube, or if you're on Patreon, you can comment there. Or if you're just listening as a podcast, you can email us, secondbreakfastpod@gmail.com. We would love to talk more about Lemon Tarts in space. Tune in next time where we talk to Tristan, to both of them. And then part 3 of this series will be me talking to Cam about the audio production portion of this book.
Editing, the nightmare.
All of the sound effects, all of that. We're going to talk about all of that. That's going to be really, really fun. So tune in for that after we talk to Tristan.
Yeah. Thank you very much for listening. I know this is a different kind of episode, but hey, I think you're going to love the book. So check it out.
I know y'all are going to love the book. Do check it out. All right. Well, we'll see y'all next time with a brand new episode.